The compact expended significant resources attempting to restrict the Terran military presence on Taurus Station. While they held little sway over official Terran delegations, they thoroughly vetted all other visitors for active military service, disqualifying any deemed threatening. By the time they began distributing visitation passes, the Galactic bureaucrats had convinced themselves they'd allowed only artists, craftsmen, and merchants aboard, holding the more dangerous human soldier caste at bay. However, this assumption proved mistaken. Humanity had prepared for the Gates' arrival for 90 years. Human civilian was a term relegated to old jokes and history books. All humans received training in combat skills, with schools teaching fieldcraft and small unit tactics alongside academic subjects. Every adult also served a 4-year term in one of the uniformed services, though none were compelled to fight. The Terran Armed Forces' active duty and reserve strength was staggering, posing a challenge for the Admiralty in selecting operatives for Taurus Station, not due to a lack of volunteers, but rather a surplus. Thus, each of the harmless and influential tourists the compact approved for Taurus Station had at least a decade of military experience. Chief Warrant Officer Zira was one such visitor, ostensibly seeking inspiration for his award-winning poetry, but in reality leading the Lotus Vanguard's 9th Squad. As the war broke out, the unassuming writer calmly received 2 words in his field of vision from a computer linked to his ocular nerve. Gamma Tau. Plan Alpha, the poet thought. Fortunate we don't need to destroy this place after all. He finished his coffee and gazed down at a mostly empty notepad, while somewhere on the ship, his squad began moving. Their comm network was nearly undetectable, blending into the background hum and vibration of the station. But the channel remained silent. Radio discipline was deeply ingrained in the mobilized human forces. Calloway waited for 7 agonizing minutes. Then he rose and strode towards a restricted bulkhead, guarded by a surly-looking Weakor. The 3-legged alien contorted his mouth into an unsettling semblance of a smile and permitted the poet to pass. The poet had bribed the guard months ago, claiming the noise and rumble of the station's maintenance passageways aided his concentration. The Weakor, doubtless under orders to accommodate the human artists, had eagerly accepted the money. That had dealt with 9th Squad's first obstacle. The next came shortly after, a security bulkhead. The thick doors sealed off the more critical areas of the station: life support, defense systems, security offices, and the anti-plants. Instead of a live watcher, a suite of biometric tests stood guard over this passage. It hissed open at Calloway's approach, the many alarms silent. A human technician had guided him through the complicated bypass the first time he talked his way past the guard. The cameras covering the next hallway had been trickier. With no way to access the closed camera network, 9th Squad had been forced to devise a more creative solution. The poet blinked 3 times in rapid succession, transmitting a single click over his squad's comm network. A few minutes later, he received 2 clicks in reply. Sergeant Lyria's diversion had commenced. She'd spent the better part of the last month assembling psych profiles on all high-profile Nictra who frequented Station Level 9. She'd pared the list down to the 20 most aggressive individuals, tagging each with a small, nearly undetectable tracking beacon. Then she'd unleashed 8 of 9th Squad's 14 members on them, with orders to make their lives miserable. It had worked flawlessly. Calloway smiled at the thought of Sergeant Lyria, a diminutive singer from some avant-garde post-futurist rock group, challenging a towering werewolf. It was the weakest link of their plan. The Nitra were professionals, but the humans hoped the guards wouldn't pay too much attention to the cameras monitoring the final approach. Why watch your doorstep when humans were picking fights on your level? The poet sprinted the 200-meter corridor, covering the distance in 22 seconds, and paused outside the door, listening for any sign the guards had detected his approach. There were none. Allowing himself a brief grin, Calloway drew 3 carbon-bladed knives. 2 were small and delicately balanced, while the third's blade was as long as his forearm. Then he unlocked the door with a stolen keycard and stormed in. His HUD sprang to life as he cleared the room. The supervisor, vital points highlighted, desperately lunged towards an alarm switch, but one of Calloway's smaller knives slipped in through a weak neck joint, taking him down. Another Niactra took a knife to the throat a half-second later, his gun barely halfway out of its holster. The remaining two guards had only just begun to turn from the spectacle on their screens when the poet reached them. His long blade flashed out once, then twice, and both toppled over. Calloway broke radio silence, his words ringing out over the stealth ship's loudspeakers. "This is Calloway of 9th Squad. We're in." The Marines on board the TAS Nighthawk cheered. They'd been living in the cramped zero-G troop ship for the past month, and tensions were starting to run high. The flight crew hardly noticed, busy guiding the stealthy Shadow-class corvette into position. Even the vaunted human stealth technology couldn't hide the telltale space-time ripples caused by matter annihilation plants, grav drives, and the inertial dampeners needed to take advantage of a modern starship's Delta V. A Wraith was thus designed to surprise, rather than to hide, lurking at a distance before powering up its colossal drive core. A lone squadron of the diminutive corvettes had been covertly transported through the gate and positioned beyond Taurus Station's sensor range. 13 minutes prior, when the Compact had initiated hostilities by dispatching a fleet of battleships through the gate, the corvettes had activated their anti-plants. Major Rathus studied the tactical display on the Casper's bridge as the corvettes drifted to a stop. Taurus Station was not devoid of life, though its garrison of 11,000 troops had been caught out of position and remained unaware of the Marines. They would not surrender without a fight. The true battle lay ahead. Lieutenant Vero and Corporal Tyron stared silently at their new weapons and armor. Specialist Kieran was already running the final checks on his suit. "Enough chatter, you two," Lieutenant Vero interjected. "You're spoiling the moment." After dropping mottled off on the TADS Resolute, the three soldiers had been temporarily reassigned to Major Geary's boarding company. An awestruck ensign had guided them to the newly established advanced base, shown them the armory, then hurriedly excused himself. The two humans hadn't moved since the transport sleds had hissed open. Human engineers were integrating new galactic technologies into old designs faster than the Navy could roll out the updates. The Terrans, fully aware that they could never equip every soldier with the latest and greatest, had resorted to trickling out new designs and models whenever they could. The TAS Nighthawk had brought only the newest equipment, fresh from R&D. By comparison, Lieutenant Vero's official powered armor was close to 3 years old, and Corporal Tyron's ERT rig hadn't seen an upgrade in 5. The Mark 15 BCPs was the latest model, created thanks to recent breakthroughs in human miniaturization efforts that had allowed the designers to triple the onboard fusion reactor's output. R&D was justifiably proud of this iteration. None of the additional power could be fed into the suit's defensive screens, which had already plateaued and would remain the same, barring a breakthrough in gravity manipulation technology. The shoulder-mounted weapons had remained untouched, too. The engineers had instead utilized the increased energy budget to create the first-ever infantry cloaking module. The perfection-obsessed Compact had never bothered with the technology, painfully aware that a matter annihilation reactor capable of generating a continual cloak would shine like a beacon on any decent grav wave detector. Human combat armor, however, did not use anti-plants. The Mark HFY's miniaturized fusion reactors could generate a continuous but weak cloaking field, bending light around its wearer just enough to obscure their outline and confuse a hostile soldier. A trickle-fed capacitor could also be used to bring the field up to its full strength for 2 or 3 minutes at a time, rendering a slow-moving BCP completely invisible in just about every vision-capable EM wavelength. This lent the phrase, "they'll never see us coming," a whole new meaning. Jenkins' moment was interrupted by the Major's entrance. "Cease your daydreaming, men. I need you in the field." All three turned to face the Terran commander. He began his brief briefing. "The newly formed Scrap Squad will be picking up the slack left by the Headless's core blowout. Their squad was tasked with reinforcing a certain Chief Warrant Officer Calloway. His group is holding Station Level 9's security office with holdouts and scavenge guns, so try to reach them quickly. That security office is our only link into Lotus's hardened networks. If we lose them, the Galactics regain their sensors and cameras. They may even realize they outnumber us. You'll have a handful of volunteers from the men we brought to hold this position, but I can't spare them all. 11 men and a grav sled full of armor is all you get, and you must push through 4 enemy-held levels. Your HUDs should already have the route loaded. Good luck out there. Captain Kira Swiftwings, You have command of Scrap Squad. The major turned to leave, then paused. Oh? And Lieutenant Varro? Yes, sir? Do not touch anything that might be a transmitter, Corporal Tyron cautioned. The massive ERT's shoulder-mounted pulsar cannon tore through the Eniactra barricades, its torrent of fire shredding alien and cover alike. The wolfish defenders stood no chance. We figured out how to counter these tactics weeks ago, thought Specialist Kieran. Kieran's squad's two Neji dropped down on the more heavily entrenched Niactra, micro-bomb launchers spitting out a steady stream of explosive pellets as they glided past the cover. Lieutenant Varro, advance and secure that access way, Specialist Kieran directed. Ramirez, watch our backs. We cannot lose that sled while we're just 2 floors away. Balded and Streak, catch your breath and then join Lieutenant Varro. The blade slipped through a gap in the armor and struck Corporal Janus in the armpit. As the frenzied lupine withdrew the knife for another attack, Corporal Tyron landed a blow that sent the assailant crashing into the bulkhead. The rest of the squad tore the wolf apart with pulsar fire. Lieutenant Varro frantically stripped off the armor plates around the stab wound, but he couldn't halt the internal bleeding. Myers succumbed to his injuries a few minutes later. Corporal Tyron was hit hardest by the loss. It took 2 Marines to physically restrain him from charging forward on his own to seek vengeance. Now isn't the time, buddy, said Lieutenant Varro. Shit happens. Marines die. Best thing you can do for Myers is keep your head and stick to the mission. Corporal Tyron only grunted, but he stopped struggling. Scrap's squad soon resumed their advance towards Calloway's troops, subdued. Last rifle's dry, subvocalized Sergeant Lyria. Anyone got a spare? The surviving members of 9th Squad transmitted back a chorus of no's. Only a few of them had automatic weapons left. Most were down to their slow-firing holdout pistols. They'd fallen back from the fortified outer hallway half an hour ago, driven back by their dwindling ammo and the Nictra push. There were a lot of attackers. The Compact really didn't want the humans sitting in one of their command and control centers. Now they fired occasional bursts of fire out through the door and prayed that the lupines gathered outside didn't charge. Only 11 humans were left, nowhere near enough to keep from being overrun. Merchant Tylon, a hideously wealthy businessman back on Mars, poked a small reflective mirror around the door's corner. He cursed aloud as pulsar darts tore it to shreds. Bastards are moving up nice and slow-like. They'll be close enough to get a good look at us in a few minutes. Calloway grunted, his eyes focused on some unseen diagram generated by his implants. He'd spent most of the firefight vainly trying to find some clever solution to their current predicament. Sergeant Lyria sighed as she checked the charge on her small pistol. More than 100 shots were left, but the weapon's slow cycling time would limit its usefulness if the Nictra stormed through the door. Suddenly, 9th Squad's leader, normally a grim-faced warrant officer, broke out laughing. Every human in the room, save Merchant Tilan, who was watching the door, turned to stare. Help's finally arrived. It's a shame they shot out the cameras, because this is going to be one hell of a show, the officer said. Merchant. Tylon peeked around the corner, then darted through the door. It's clear, he sent over the commnet. The werewolves are a little bit distracted right now. Sergeant Lyria slipped through the door next, taking cover behind one of the many waist-high barricades near the entrance. The orderly Nictra push had dissolved into chaos. Small visual distortions were the only sign of Scrap's squad's 3 Neji as they darted about behind enemy lines, slaughtering unaware Compact troops with microbombs and pulsar fire. Beyond them, blurred humanoid figures dashed between cover, firing with both shoulder-mounted weapons and rifles. Even Sergeant Lyria, fully aware of the capabilities of the latest Terran armor, had trouble keeping track of the Terran assault as they slaughtered the surprised Nictra. 200 Compact soldiers were dead in 2 minutes. As the grav sled slid around the corner and Terrans started dropping their cloaks, Sergeant Lyria turned to Calloway. Still worried about holding the choke point, Chief? She asked. Not at all, Sergeant. Not at all, he replied. Warrior Thex's last lesson gave him strength as he took up his position in the defensive line. His battle father had delivered the short, traditional benediction mere hours before. Do our bloodline proud. Repay the great debt. Somewhere behind him, tucked into the ranks of the bloodied, his family was ready. His birth father and birth mother, his battle father and battle mother, and dozens of his older siblings, cousins, and their mates steadied pulse rifles and manned heavier cannons. They'd hold the Galactic Pride's central command to the last warrior. The inexperienced warriors crouched in the front ranks, compensating for their lack of heavy weapons and experience with numbers and training. Every young fighter must prove themselves there before fighting alongside the veterans, and Wep was just one of hundreds who hoped to bloody themselves today. First they had to survive, though, and the scattered reports coming in from across the station had even the Nyctra fearing what was to come. Beside him, Asha adjusted her grip on the pulse rifle she cradled. The subtle motion drew Wep's gaze, and he twitched his ears in approval. She noticed. "Claim me as a mate after we've slaughtered these devils, pup. Now's not the time for distractions." "Pup? I've known you since we scampered about in the nurseries. Yet you're always going to be a pup to me. Funny how that works." They lapsed into silence, eyes focused forward, until Wep spoke. "So, you don't believe the rumors?" Lael snorted. "Do you mean the so-called footage of a single human slaughtering 5 of the bloodied with knives? The whispers of ghosts stalking the corridors? Or the reports that the Neji have grown a spine and learned to fight?" Wep couldn't help but laugh at the last two. "Okay, nothing about the ghosts, and the thought of the little songbirds in anything other than full retreat is pretty absurd. But the security video's a little disturbing. It's supposed to be the last thing Central picked up before the cams went dead. We didn't lose them. The Saviors cut them to keep those traitorous Weakor from selling the feeds to the humans. Where'd you hear that from?" "Our claw leader made the rounds before you made it to the line. Gave us a rundown. Terrans fired on a handful of merchant vessels without warning and then sent hundreds of troopships through the gate. Point defense got as many as they could, but the devils kept coming." Lael's ears flared back, conveying her disgust as she spoke of the Terrans' callous disregard for their warriors. Wep's remained perked and thoughtful. From what he'd seen of the human artists, merchants, and even the few warriors who'd come aboard the Galactic Pride, the Terrans valued any life far too much to toss them aside on the Pride's formidable arsenal. Still, if the alternative was that the Saviors were wrong— "Claws extended, fangs bared!" shouted the pack leader. The Terrans were coming. Pulsar darts started to land among the Nyctra as Wep aimed down his rifle sights, desperately trying to find a target. The humans were damn hard to spot. Instead of the black-armored humans he'd expected to find, the oncoming fire seemed to spring from scores of heavily blurred figures. Wep fired at the Terrans, but his shots passed harmlessly through a patch of distorted light that he had been certain concealed a human. His other packmates fared little better. A brief flicker of movement caught Wep's eye, causing the Nyctra to spray a burst of pulsar darts towards the ceiling. A small armored figure materialized and dropped to the ground, its chest shredded by 4 well-placed shots. Beside him, Lael let out a feral cry of delight. "Somebody just earned their stripes!" The pack leader must have been watching, because a few seconds later, orders came through for every 4th unbloodied to focus their fire upwards. Enemy fire concentrated on these shooters, but it was too late. Wep's quick thinking stopped the Neji from outflanking the defenders and crushing them instantly. The Terrans kept advancing, though, forcing the compact soldiers back meter by meter, while staying just outside of the Nyctra's effective range. Several of the unbloodied abandoned their positions, bringing dishonor and shame to their dying bloodline. But Wep and Lael stood fast. The 1,000-strong pack was soon reduced to less than 300. The Terrans picked off the defenders with ruthless efficiency, pairing heavy suppressive fire with lethally accurate sharpshooters, while the Nyctra could only snap off poorly aimed shots whenever they could spot one of the indistinct attackers. Most went wide. Human forms flickered insubstantially as they sprang from cover to cover, never staying in the open long enough for the defenders to line up a shot. A push forward by 40 or so unbloodied was cut down long before they could reach the offensive lines. A countercharge by Terran troops reached the Nyctra lines and almost routed the entire force. By the time they'd fallen back to the final positions just outside of Central, the defenders numbered less than 50. Wep felt nothing but bitterness as he accepted the heavy cloth badge. He had been forced to leave her unconscious and bleeding body behind as they retreated. Quite the contrary. Any of our artists and merchants who have conversed with theirs have returned full of praise. Whatever else they may be, their poets are truly poets. I'm afraid there is no escape. Terran forces have sealed off all 9 exterior bays, disabled the railcar system, and rooted out the hideaways we would typically command from. Surrender? Our pack has never endured the disgrace of surrender. The Nyctra flicked his ears helplessly. We fight at the Savior's pleasure, and the Savior's demand surrender. Now get that rifle down and try not to look threatening. Wep complied, his ears flaring back with rage. Damn the Saviors! Damn them for throwing away everything that his pack had died to protect. The Terran soldiers surged forward, and Wep closed his eyes, unwilling to watch what came next. He hoped that the executions were painless. The Nyctra's eyes snapped open in surprise when one of the taller Terrans, a human, snapped restraints onto his hands and feet, then gestured for him to rise. He complied weakly, desperately trying to figure out what was happening. Were the humans escorting him away to end his life quietly? Did they plan to maim him, forcing him to bear the shame of surrender for the rest of his days? Would he become one of their slaves? Wep's mind was still churning as they led him back to a makeshift camp, set up a short distance from the blood-soaked corridors. Scores of injured humans and Neji were laid out on stretchers, far less threatening without their terrifying powered armor. Next came a small morgue, where perhaps 20 shrouded bodies lay, and beyond that were even more of the wounded, but none of these warriors were Terran. They were Nyctra. Wep let out a stifled gasp and hobbled towards one of the injured figures. A guard raised his weapon, preparing to fire, but another gestured for him to wait. Their prisoner's movements hardly seemed threatening. Wep soon bent over a barely conscious Lael, awkwardly cradling her head in his bound arms. She was delirious, intoxicated by whatever medicine the humans had used to dull her pain, but she still stirred at his touch. "Wep," she croaked. "Did we?" "Later," he whispered, choking back tears. "Worry later. For now, rest." Taurus Station's central command was filled with soldiers, Lieutenant Vero and Specialist Kieran among them. Corporal Tyron had declined to join the final charge against the compact troops. "Hey, Specialist Kieran, this one of those things I'm not supposed to touch?" The Neji, one wing swaddled in an armored cast, glanced over at Lieutenant Vero. "Yes, Lieutenant Vero, that's a transmitter. Probably good for the station intercom or the official compact network. Now step back before you... What are you doing?" The Marine paused with his finger on the broadcast key. "What do you think I'm doing?" "Being you, I suppose. Give me a few seconds to get out of the room before you destroy what's left of your career." "Thanks, Specialist Kieran. You're the best." "No, I was never here. Now don't you have a major to piss off?" "Right, yeah." Lieutenant Vero squared his shoulders and turned on the pickup. "Taurus Station, this is Lieutenant Walsh, Lieutenant Vero. You might remember me from when I stormed the former GCS RAM 7 years ago. You may also wonder what I'm doing on the PA. Well, wonder no more. Terrans just got ourselves another stick."
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.